Okay, Boker Tov. So nice to see all of you. Thank you, Rabbi Ephraim and Rabbi Murray, for inviting me. This morning, B'Shuschem, I'd like to explore together with you Lag Ba'Omer. What is Lag Ba'Omer? Why do we celebrate Lag Ba'Omer? For those of you who celebrate Lag Ba'Omer, what are we celebrating? What is significant about the day? What compels hundreds of thousands, estimates up to 500,000 Israelis each year to spend hours traveling on buses and sit in traffic in cars going up to Meron, the kever of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? This year, of course, as I'm sure you heard, the celebrations in Meron are canceled in light of the security situation. The roads are closed due to the threat of rockets and missiles, lo aleinu, from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And there's already a real concern that some Mishugayim won't listen and will try and still access Meron. For them, it's Yahareg v'al Yavor.
That's only some.
Only some. I said some, a few Mishugayim ad kidei kach that even though the police, the state said that all celebrations are canceled and the roads would be closed, I saw that the Sephardic chief rabbi had to come out and still dissuade people from trying to access the site. Because as we know, during Corona, when we weren't supposed to gather, people went and gathered. And over the last 2.5 years, people went, even though it was dangerous. You've heard stories, I'm sure, maybe even have neighbors who snuck into Uman in the Ukraine during Corona when they tried to prevent Israelis from traveling during Corona, or over the last few years with the war in Ukraine. So what's this business of pilgrimages to Lag Ba'Omer, and why is it so important for so many? I first asked myself this very question as over the last 16 years, when we've been fortunate to live al Admas HaKodesh, Lag Ba'Omer has fallen out a number of times on Motzei Shabbos. And when Lag Ba'Omer falls out on Motzei Shabbos, the chief rabbinate also dissuades people from coming on Motzei Shabbos and instead postpones the celebrations to Sunday to prevent mass Chilul Shabbos, because the police, the emergency services would have to prepare to make sure the roads are safe and make sure there's enough ambulances, etc. And if it would be Motzei Shabbos, it would require Chilul Shabbos. And nevertheless, people didn't listen. So I started asking myself the question, what are they doing? What are we really celebrating on Lag Ba'Omer? Is it even the Yurtzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? And so this morning we'll survey both, halacha and history. And I'd like to look together with you at Lag Ba'Omer in the context of Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, because it falls out right in the middle of Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, and ask, Ma HaKesher, or Ma Pesher HaKesher. Maybe there's some sort of connection, some lesson. Lag Ba'Omer, yes.
What's the Hebrew date?
The 33rd. Oh, what day of the month? Yudchet. Yudchet Iyar. Chai. Okay, good. But what does that mean? Right?
Well,
okay.
One of the reasons we stop, one of the reasons for Sphere is Rabbi Akiva's children, students stop dying.
So we'll see. We'll see what the source is for that. Good. We'll see what the source is for that. Okay, Cinco de Mayo this year, I guess. Okay, right. Tomorrow's the 5th. Okay, good. So you can have a cerveza at your Lag Ba'Omer barbecue tomorrow. Interestingly, Lag Ba'Omer, either Lamed Gimel Ba'Omer, the 33rd day of the Omer, or 18th of Iyar, Chai Iyar, as a date of significance, is not mentioned anywhere in Chazal. It's not mentioned in the Mishnah, not mentioned in the Gemara. It's found nowhere in rabbinic literature, in midrashic literature. It's not even mentioned in the Zohar. Where does the date come from? So first, you'll turn your attention to source number 1 here, the famous Gemara in Yevamos, which speaks about the students of Rabbi Akiva, which Mari mentioned already. And the context here in Yevamos is the mitzvah to procreate. And the Gemara draws on a pasuk from Koheles, Babokir zra et zarecha, v'la erev al tanaf yadecha. In the morning you shall sow your seed, and in the evening you shall not put down your hand, don't rest. You have to continue to procreate, says the Gemara, And in addition, in that context, Rabbi Akiva teaches, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Lamad Torah b'yalduso, someone who studied Torah in his youth, Yilmod Torah b'ziknuso, should also study Torah in his old age. Hayulo talmidim b'yalduso, if he had students in his youth, if he taught Torah to students in his youth, Yulo talmidim b'ziknuso, he should also have students in his old age. Shenemar b'boker zra et zarecha. The Gemara here draws on that same pasuk from Koheles. In the morning you shall sow your seed, and then don't rest. Don't rest on your laurels. You have to keep going in life. Keep being productive, right? Okay, that's the context here. And after telling us that according to Rabbi Akiva, you have to continue to raise up students even in an advanced age, the Gemara continues. Amru, they said, Shnemasar elef zugim talmidim hayu lo Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students, 24,000 students. There are parallel passages elsewhere in rabbinic literature that has a smaller number. Okay, dibru chachamim belashon guzma. Sometimes our sages speak in hyperbole to emphasize a point. He had a lot of students. Okay, 12,000 pairs of students. Mi Givat ad Antipras, from Givat to Antipatras. Givat is near Migdal HaEmek today in Emek Yisrael. There's a kibbutz there that bears the name. Antipatras or Antipatris was a city built in the 1st century BCE by King Herod, named in honor of his father. And these are sites up north. At the time, the Jewish settlement was up north. The Romans banned the Jews from living in Yerushalayim. They turned Yerushalayim into a pagan city, Aelia Capitolina. So he had 24,000 students, Migivat ad Antipras, v'kulan meisu beperek echad, and they all died in one period of time, mipnei shelo nagu kavod ze lazeh, for they didn't give honor one to another. And there's a lot to say on this passage. What exactly did they do wrong? But based on this, we observe customs of mourning, of course, during Sfiras HaOmer, although, interestingly, the Gemara here doesn't make mention of any customs of mourning. So some suggest that actually comes much later, and the customs of mourning we observe during Sfiras HaOmer and associate with the students of Rabbi Akiva actually are a response to the first Crusades. But that's for another time. In any case, the Gemara continues, Vaya olam shameim. The world was empty. It was empty of Torah. It was desolate. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva eitza Rabbeinu shebedarom. Ushna lehem Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yudah, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. Until Rabbi Akiva went down to the rabbis in the south. It doesn't mean the Negev, doesn't mean he went down to Beersheba, but maybe the southern Galil HaTachton. As I said, the Jewish settlement was in the north during this time. And he raised up 5 great students. Among them, Rabbi Shimon. We'll come back to that. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Midu Torah oso shah, and they upheld Torah at that time. The Gemara said that the world was shameim, it was empty, it was desolate of Torah. Our very Masorah was in jeopardy until Rabbi Akiva came along and raised up these 5 students. And again, the whole point of departure for the Gemara in relating this story is what? That Rabbi Akiva taught you should teach students in your youth and teach students in your old age. And that's precisely what Rabbi Akiva did. Rabbi Akiva could have thrown in the towel. He could have quit. He could have given up. All of his students had died. And it would seem that he was already at an advanced age. He could have gone into retirement, but instead he had the strength of spirit to raise up 5 new students. I'm sure it was not easy for him. The Gemara continues, Tana, it was taught, Kula Mesui Pesach va'ad Atzeres. They all died between Pesach and Shavuos. Some versions have pros Atzeres, some Rishonim have a girsa, Gaonim and Rishonim have a girsa that they died from Pesach until somewhere midway to Shavuos. Okay, but in the standard edition of the Gemara, it says Mi Pesach va'ad Atzeres. Again, take note, doesn't say anything about Lag Ba'Omer. Amar Rav Chama bar Abba v'itema Rabbi Chia bar Avin kula mesu misara. They all died a terrible death. What's a terrible death? Mahi? Amar Rav Nachman askara, which is often defined as diphtheria. Okay, but some explain that perhaps this is code. And they died in the Mered Bar Kochba, which took place between 132 and 135 of the Common Era. And that's why the Gemara describes them as pairs, because they would go off to war and march in pairs. And so there's a lot here to unpack. But for our purposes here this morning, this is the source that during this period of time, Sfiras HaOmer, between Pesach and Shavuos, the students of Rabbi Akiva died. Note, makes no mention of customs of mourning, as I said, and also, for our purposes this morning, doesn't say anything about Lag Ba'Omer. So where does that come from? If you don't mind, I'll take questions at the end. The earliest source that mentions Lag Ba'Omer, the earliest source that mentions Lag Ba'Omer is from 12th century Provence. That would seem to be the earliest source to mention Lag Ba'Omer as a date of significance. It comes here from the Sefer HaManhig in source number 2 of Rav Avram ben Nosson Hayarchi, who lived from 1155 to 1215. He was born in Lunil in Provence. Why is he called Rabbi Avraham Hayarchi, the author of the Sefer HaManhig? Well, Lunil, right, is lunar. Lunil, lunar, moon. Yareach, Yarchi, okay? And he eventually moves to Spain. He cites another one of the Chochmei Provence, a little earlier, Rav Zerachia Halevi, the Baal Hamor, 12th century Provence. And he writes the following here in source number 2. V'ach minhag b'tzarfasu Provencia liknos milamed gimel ba'omer va'elach. The minhag in Provence and in France, Provence was in southern France. They had minhagim that were unique. In some ways, they were a bridge between Ashkenaz and Sfard, because it's southern France, south of France, and north of Spain. There's a lot of scholarship written about Provence and their minhagim. In any case, he writes that the minhag in France and Provence was to get married from Lag Ba'Omer and onward. In other words, up until that point, we observe customs of mourning. We don't make weddings. But already from Lag Ba'Omer, the customs of mourning are suspended, and you can get married. Most of you are married. Vishamati b'shem Rabbi Zerachia Halevi Zal mi Gironda. He first came from Girona, Spain, before settling in Provence. This is Rabbi Zerachia Halevi, the Baal Hamor. Shematzak kasu b'sefer Yashan haba misfarad. Oh, he found in a very old book that came from Spain. So it seems that they already had an early tradition, maybe already from the period of the Gaonim, that Rabbi Akiva's students stopped dying, as Murray said, on Tai Iyar, on Lag Ba'Omer, okay? Shemesu mi Pesach vad pros hatzeres. As I said, many have a girsa that the Gemara in Yevamos says that the students of Rabbi Akiva, they died between Pesach and pros hatzeres, somewhere halfway, midway, pros, like prusa. Umay pursa, what's pursa? Palga, half. Kiditnat, as we have in the Gemara in Pesachim, Sholim behilchos Pesach kodem Pesach lamed yom. We have to begin learning the laws of Pesach before Pesach, already 30 days. Upalga tesvav yom, and half is tesvav. V'tesvav yom kodem ha'atzeres zeu lag ba'omer. So a little bit of a drasha that pros implies 15, because in the Gemara in Pesachim that pursa is half of 30, right? Half of 30 is 15, so 15 days before Atzeres is Lag Ba'Omer. Okay. And we have other sources as well. The Beis Yosef here in source number 4, for instance, quotes a source that actually, this is found in a medrash. It's not a medrash that we have, but that the students of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying 15 days before Shavuos on Lag Ba'Omer. Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz also cites a medrash. By the way, it's not uncommon for especially Baalei Tosfos to cite midrashim that we no longer have in our extant midrashic literature. Many times Rishonim will quote midrashim that we no longer have. The Meiri here in source number 3 writes something very similar. I'll just take questions in a moment. You'll forgive me. V'talmidim elu, the Meiri in his comments on the Gemara in Yevamos writes that these students, Huskar Khan, that are mentioned here, Shekula Mesumi Pesach Varatzeres, who all died between Pesach and Shavuos, the Kabbalah Biyada Gaonim, and we have a tradition already from the Gaonim. Does he mean the period that we call the Gaonic period? The rabbis that we call the Gaonim are just earlier rabbis. Could mean that means earlier rabbis. As I said, according to the Ba'Omer, he has a Sefer Yashan from Sfard. Okay, so that this old tradition should be Yom Lamed Gimel Ba'Omer Paska Hamisa. On the 33rd day of the Omer, the students of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying. Now, just a technical question, right? Well, a couple of technical questions, which we'll have to deal with. And this is a question that the Pri Chodesh asks. Since when do you celebrate a day when people stop dying, right? It's one thing to say, okay, maybe the customs of mourning are suspended, right? That's what the Sefer HaManig writes, that's what the Meiri writes, that's what many write. That since they stop dying, the customs of mourning are suspended. Okay? But to go ahead and celebrate such a day, I mean, imagine, would you celebrate a day when people stop dying? It's schwer. Oh, so good. So that's what the Gra answers. Yeah, Tu B'Av, right? Okay. The Gemara at the end of Tanis explains why Tu B'Av is such a happy day. Ad Kedei Kach, the Mishnah says, Lo hayu yamim tov l'isot kechamisha asar b'av yom kippurim. So one of the reasons that the Gemara gives as to why Tu B'Av is such a happy day is because the Dor HaMidbar stopped dying. Okay, but the Gemara also goes on to give a handful of other reasons why Tu B'Av was such a happy day. In other words, if it was only the fact that the students of the Dor HaMidbar, stopped dying, I don't know if you would celebrate it as such a happy day, because the Gemara gives other reasons. But that's what the Gra says. Okay, and another question: if they stopped dying, according to these sources, on the 33rd day of the Omer, that implies that maybe there were some who died on the 33rd day, right? You said they stopped dying. Well, when did they stop, right? Was it in the morning? Was it in the afternoon? Right? So first, do you celebrate a day when people stop dying? And secondly, if they stopped on the 33rd day, that means there were some who still died on the 33rd. So what are we doing here? So interestingly, if you look at the Shulchan Aruch here in source number 5, that's why for the Sfardim, the Shulchan Aruch paskins that the customs of mourning are suspended from the 34th day, from Lamed Dalet and onward. Okay? But for the Ramah, and this is Minhag Ashkenaz, the customs of mourning are already suspended on the 33rd. And in addition, the Ramah says, where I've underlined towards the bottom of the page in source number 5, Umidinos elu eino agid kidvarav elam yistaprin b'yom lamed gimel. We don't paskin like the Shulchan Aruch that the customs of mourning are suspended only from the 34th day and on, but we already suspend the customs of mourning from the 33rd day. Umar bimbo ktsas simcha. De'eino rimbo tachanan. And we have a little simcha, and we don't say tachanan. Notice nothing about going up to Meiron, making bonfires, okay, bows and arrows, chai rotel, reading passages from the Zohar. Right? You don't say tachanan. For many people, not saying tachanan is a big simcha, right? That's not ksas simcha, that's a big simcha. Right? So we're going to have to ask the question, how do you get from marbin bo ksas simcha to the pilgrimages in Meiron? Okay? But first there were some questions. Yes, you had a question and then. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I just wanted to say it because on an Erev Yantif, right, we don't say tachanan. If you want to say that it's a special day, so then already Erev the special day. Okay? Yes. Okay, there are different minhagim. That's something that the post can discuss. Can you already take a haircut and shave tonight, or do you have to wait till tomorrow morning? Okay, that's for another time. Yes. Yes, and then yes. Yeah. Right. I was hoping you wouldn't notice that. Maybe that's another reason why the Shulchan Aruch writes from the 34th day. Okay? Because really, it's not 15 days, it's 16 days. Okay. I was hoping you wouldn't figure that out. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, I didn't say anything about the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. I said we don't pass like the Shulchan Aruch. We Ashkenaz. Wait, 1 minute. We Ashkenazim. We pass like the Ramah. That's what I meant. Okay. The Shulchan Aruch says wait till the 34th day, and that's what the Sfardim do. The Ramah says wait already the 33rd day you can get a haircut, and that's what we Ashkenazim do. That's what I meant. Okay. Yes. Uh-huh.
You still have the same practices. It even happened in Shvat or Vegas.
That's a good question. There are Bali Machshava, Bali Musar that try to draw a connection between the Avelus that is observed during Yemei Siyas Omer with the count itself. But L'chora, I mean, the Torah tells you, Sfartem Lachem, the Torah commands you to count from when the Omer offering is brought, and that would seem to be something very positive, right? You're bringing the Korban HaOmer, and you are, and it's in preparation of bringing the Mincha Chadasha, the Shtei HaLechem, this new type of meal offering in Shavuos. It connects Pesach with Shavuos. It's Atzeres. Some look at it as one long period of Chol HaMoed. It's a happy period, L'chora. Some also see it perhaps as a period of purification before we could be Makabel, the Torah at Har Sinai, that the Jewish people had sunk to the 49th level of Tumen, Mitzrayim, and they had to purify themselves. So it's a period of purification, a happy period. Maybe it's one long Sfiras HaOmer between Pesach and Itzat Seres Shavuos. And L'chor, it's not really related, or the customs of mourning are not really connected, except for some Bali Musar, Bali Machshava. No, you see that Taka it is, because this is a period of purification and reflection and introspection and cheshbon nefesh. And so it's dafka, this time period, when we came to Har Sinai, ki ish echad b'leiv echad, like one man with one heart, unified, that dafka during this period, that's when the students of Rabbi Akiva died, and that's when tragedies befell the Jewish people. So we have to turn inwards during this period of purification and reflection and introspection and ask why and try to improve and do tshuva and more. So there are those who do make such a connection, but l'chora, it's not connected. Okay. So anyway, coming back to our question. So what's this business with all of these celebrations? How do you go from Marbin Bo Ktsas Simcha in the lashon of the Ramah to bonfires and pilgrimages to Meron and singing and dancing and studying the Zohar and bows and arrows and giving chayrotel? So if you ask any child in Gan, they'll tell you that Lag Ba'Omer is a happy day. Why? Because of no school, okay. Or because it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's Yeritzeit. They all know, oh, it's Rabbi Shimon's Yeritzeit. And that's what we're celebrating. Oh, good. Since when do we celebrate a Yeritzeit? Good, we'll have to ask that question. But first, a more fundamental question, is it even his Yeritzeit? And that is very, in modern Hebrew, mu'rupal. That's very unclear, cloudy, like the weather today, nebulous. That is very questionable. Okay? And here, if you look at source number 6, this comes from the Kisvei Ha'ari, the Shar HaKavanos of Rav Chaim Vital, who lived from 1542 to 1620. Here he describes how his Rebbe, the Ari HaKadosh, went with his son and his family up to Meron, gave his son a haircut up there. And you have parallel passages which appear a number of places in the Kisvei Ha'ari. Rav Chaim Vital, of course, was the Talmud Muvhak of the Ari HaKadosh. Okay? So he's describing the minhag of the Ari, and this would seem to be the earliest source which describes a pilgrimage up to Meron, up to the kever of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai on Lag Ba'Omer, and also an early source which describes the minhag of upshearing or chalakeh, giving a child a haircut. Okay? Now, if you look here, the passages where I've underlined doesn't say anything about the death of Rabbi Shimon. Instead, it refers to Yom Simchas Rashbi, or Yom Simchaso, Yom Simchat Rashbi, Yom Simchato, the day of his joy, the day of his celebration. And the whole notion that Lag Ba'Omer is the Yeretz site of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is most likely a printer's error, a tos defus. It's all one big misunderstanding and misinterpretation, because as was done and still done, but it was very common to abbreviate words because you used to have to pay a typesetter. Today, everything is digital, right? Today, everything is AI. Rabbis don't even have to write svarim anymore. They just put a prompt into Chat GPT. Write me a 500-page sefer on Lag Ba'Omer. Right? Right. Okay, good. It does make mistakes. It does hallucinate. In any case, because you had to pay the typeset, printing was very expensive once upon a time, and you had to pay per letter. Okay, and by the way, most of the time, the typesetters weren't even Jewish, so there were a lot of mistakes that crept in. But you had to pay per letter, so they would abbreviate words. So they abbreviated the word simcha, or simchato, or simchat, as shin mem, with a geresh, shin mem. And over time, that shin mem got misinterpreted to mean, instead of Yom Simchat Rashbi, Yom Shemet Rashbi. Okay, this is all based on a printer's error, one big misunderstanding. We have the original manuscripts, and they are just as it appears here on your source sheets, source number 6. Okay. Okay, well, that's another question for another time. The Baruch Sha'amar of Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein talks about that, as do others. Take a look here at source number 6. Inyan minhag shenagu Yisrael lalechet biyom lamed gimel Omer. Now he's writing this in the late 16th, early 17th century. Late 16th, early 17th century. So you see, by then it had already proliferated. It had already he pasheta minhag. It had already crystallized. It had already become popular. The Inyan of the minhag, which is a minhag Yisrael, Shinagu Yisrael, lalechet biyom lamed gimel laomer al kivrei Rashbi Rabbi Elazar beno. This minhag Yisrael to go up to the grave of Rashbi and Rabbi Elazar his son, asher kvurim be'ir Meiron, who are buried in the city of Meiron, kenoda, as is known, va'ochlim v'shosim u'smechim, and to eat and drink there and make merry there, right? Smechim sham. Ani re'isi l'morizal. I saw my Rebbe, the Ari Kadosh, shalach l'sham pam achat, b'yom lamed gimel laomer, hu v'chol anshe beiso, v'yashav sham shlosha yamim, rishon shel hashavua hahu, v'zeh haya pam achas sheba mimitzrayim. So I saw one year my Rebbe went with his whole household up to Meiron, to the kever of Rabbi Shimon on Lag Ba'Omer, and he was there for 3 days. And this was after after he came from Egypt. We know that the Ari was born in Yerushalayim. He lived in Egypt, ultimately returning to Yerushalayim and living in Tzfas for a short period. This is an interesting line. He says, I don't know if that was before, when he went up to Meiron, and I saw him go with his family to Meiron. I don't know if that was before or after he had achieved all of this great Kabbalistic wisdom, perhaps implying, that somehow the pilgrimage itself imbued the Ari with some sort of chokhmah nifla. Well, we don't know. He could have gone before. He's just saying, I saw him go up one year. Maybe he's saying, I don't know. He went up, it seems he went up every year. But he says, I don't know if this particular pilgrimage, when I witnessed him go up, if that was before he became the Ari Kadosh, right? Or after he became the Ari Kadosh. In any case, he says, Harav Yonasan Sagiz, Heidli Shebeshana Hachas Kodem. The previous year, Shalachti Ani Etzlo Lilmodi Marizal, before I went to learn with my Rebbe, Sholiches Beno, he went with his small son, Beno Akatan Sham, Im Kol Anshe Beiso, Vesham Gilcho Es Rosho. And there he shaved his head. Kiminhag Yadua. According to the well-known practice, Vasasham Yom Mishteh V'Simcha. And he made there a Yom Mishteh V'Simcha. You see, this was the custom of the Ari Kadosh to go each year on Lag Ba'Omer to the grave of Rabbi Shimon, and the year prior, he shaved his son's head, the Chalakeh. So as I said, this is an early source for the Chalakeh. Okay, we'll have to ask the question, right? Why are we shaving kids' heads at graves? Or why are we cutting children's hair at graves? We'll see if we have time to address that, but we'll see another example of that very shortly. I'll just hold off some questions for a few moments. I just want to get through this passage. Okay? Gam Hei, now this is an incredible story here. It's not so pleasant, but it's an incredible story nonetheless. Gam Hei, Harav Ephraim Halevi, Ki B'shana Niskeres. Rav Ephraim Halevi testified that year, right, which we mentioned, Halach Gam Husham, he was there too. Vayanoheg lomar bechol yom bevirkas tishko nachem Hashem Elokeinu es avelei Tzion. What did he say there? It was his minhag to say what? Tfilas nachem l'chora every single day for the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Okay. Now, when do we say nachem? On Tisha B'Av. Okay, on Tisha B'Av. But it was his minhag to say it l'chora every single day. The Gam B'Yoso Sham Amar Nachem. And even when he was there, this Rabbi Avram Halevi, he said the tefillah of Nachem at the grave of Rabbi Shimon when they were making the simcha and mishteh together with the Ari and his family. And I guess it was time for mincha. They made a minyan for mincha. And he said Nachem. V'achar Gamar Hamida. After he finished his Amida, Amar Le Morizal. So the Ari said, Ki Ra'abe Kitzis Rashbi, Alav Shalom Omeid Al Kivro. That while this guy was davening his Shemona Esrei and saying Nachem, the Ari saw Rabbi Shimon get up from his grave and stand on his grave, Amarlo, and he said, Emor El Ha'ish Hazeh, say to this man, Avram Halevi, Ki Lam Omer Nachem Biyom Simchasenu. Why is he saying Nachem on the day of our joy? Again, this word Simcha, because of a printer's error, gets mistaken for maybe mace. Again, this passage and similar passages appear in a number of places in the Kisvei Ha'ari. And it will be that this man who is davening for Nechama of Yerushalayim, on my day of joy, says Rabbi Shimon, he is going to have to receive consolation. He's saying the prayer of consolation. He's going to have to be Makabel Tanchumim very shortly. And it was that not a month passed, and this man's son died, one of his sons died, and he had to receive Tanchumim. Again, it's a terrible story. And Rav Chaim Vital writes, I'm recording all this to show you that there is a source of this minhag to go up to the grave of Rabbi Shimon on Lag Ba'Omer, maybe to cut your kid's hair and to celebrate. It's cause for celebration. This is a proper minhag. I am justifying this minhag. Okay. Ubiprat ki Rashbi alav shalom hu michamishat talmidei hagdolim shel Rabbi Akiva, and specifically because what? It's during this period of time when the students of Rabbi Akiva died, as we saw in the Gemara in Yevamos, which we began with, and Rabbi Shimon was one of those 5 students, and perhaps the greatest, the Aryeh Shebachabura, the greatest of all the students. Vilachein, and therefore Zman Simchaso B'Yom Lamed Gimel LaOmer. And therefore, the day of his rejoicing is Lag Ba'Omer. Now, notice Simchaso. That's how it appears in the manuscripts. But as I mentioned, that word Yom Simchaso or Zman Simchaso, Simchas Rashbi, gets abbreviated as Shin Mem Geresh and misunderstood and misinterpreted to mean Shemes, Yom Shemes Rashbi. Okay? So this here is a very, very important source. Now, some will argue that, well, of course, the day of his joy, the day of his simcha, the day of his celebration is his death. Because in the Idra Zuta, one of the sections of the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon's death is called a hilula, a great simcha, a wedding. Okay? The Zohar relates his great elevation and elation before his death and how he reveals the deepest secrets of the Torah, the deepest depths, bringing joy to the world. Okay, but all that is interpretation. That, simchato is equivalent with his death. That is interpretation. There's no evidence that it's his Yeritzeit. Now, if you challenge the idea that Lag Ba'Omer is his Yeritzeit, oy vavoy lacha. They'll put you in chayrim in certain circles, or worse. But it's not just me who's questioning this. Two of the greatest Kabbalists of the 18th and 19th centuries said that it's not his Yeritzeit. The Chida, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, who lived from 1724 to 1806. He was, by the way, a great Kabbalist, very fluent in the Kisvei Ha'ari, and he didn't interpret Simchaso to be Rashbi's Yeritzeit. He was also a posek. I mean, he was fluent in all areas of Torah, wrote hundreds and hundreds of Sfarim. Hundreds, many of his Sfarim are not even in print. I mean, he wrote hundreds of Sfarim. He was a bibliophile. He traveled. He was initially from Italy, lived here in Eretz Yisrael. There's some source sheets here if you're just coming in. And he was part of the Chalukah, not the Halakeh, the Chalukah. He traveled all over Europe raising money for the Yishuv here in Eretz Yisrael, and that allowed him access to all the great libraries of Europe. So he was an expert in manuscripts. So he understood that the correct girsa is Yom Simchaso, not Yom Misa. Okay? And the Ben Ish Chai, who lived from 1835, 1909, of Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, also believed that Lag Ba'Omer is not the Yeritzeit of Rabbi Shimon. So two of the greatest Kabbalists of the 18th and 19th centuries. So some explain what, therefore, is the Simcha. Well, maybe it's the day that Rabbi Shimon began learning from Rabbi Akiva. Okay, Rabbi Shimon was his greatest student. Even the Gemara in Yevamos that we began with mentions that Rabbi Akiva raised up 5 students, among them Rabbi Shimon. So maybe it's the day he began learning. Maybe it's the day Rabbi Shimon received smicha from Rabbi Akiva. Maybe today Rabbi Shimon and his son Elazar emerged from the cave where they were hiding from the Romans, the Gemara that you're all familiar with in Shabbos. Maybe it's the day that he revealed the Zohar, okay, which of course raises questions of the authorship of the Zohar, which is attributed to Rabbi Shimon, but that too is unclear. And if you say that in some circles, oy vavoy lacha, they'll put you in chayrim or worse, but that's for another time. Okay, his birthday could be, but there's no evidence for that. Again, all of this is interpretation. All of this is subject to interpretation. We don't have any compelling evidence to suggest that. And what's interesting is the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo, who is a contemporary of the Ari Kadosh, and they live, he's part of the whole milieu of the 16th century Kabbalists in Tzfat. The Shulchan Aruch makes no mention of Rashbi, whether it's his birthday, whether it's his Yeritzeit, whether it's the day he came out of the cave or received smicha. Makes no mentions of pilgrimages, of haircuts, or any celebration bichlal. It's the Ramah in 16th century Krakow who writes, Marbin bo ktsas simcha. Okay? So the history is very unclear, very nebulous, very me'urpal. Yes. Oh, okay. Thank you for letting me know. We will let him into the Zoom. Bivadai. Okay. Welcome, Andy. Now, assuming it's Rabbi Shimon's Yeritzeit, as Jake asked, since when do you celebrate a Yeritzeit? Turn it into a Yom Tov. Okay. Interestingly, the Shulchan Aruch records a minhag that maybe some of you have, to fast on the Yeritzeit of a parent. We'll see shortly a very important passage in the Shulchan Aruch, here in source number 7, where historically there was a minhag to fast on the anniversary of the deaths of some of our great Ishei Tanakh, some of our great leaders. Okay? So since when do you celebrate a Yeritzeit? You fast on a Yeritzeit. Okay? Well, it develops over time in Kabbalah, in Chasidus, among Sfardim, among Chasidim, to make a tikkun, right? To have a l'chaim and shul, to make a tikkun. And for the Kabbalists and Hasidim and Eidot HaMizrach, on the anniversary of the death of a tzaddik, to celebrate it as a hilula. Again, the Zohar calls Rabbi Shimon's death a hilula, a wedding. It's a day when the neshama of the righteous individual weds the heavens. Okay? He returns his pure soul to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and there's a wedding in heaven that takes place. So, okay, in Kabbalistic and Hasidic circles, and that becomes minhag for the Eidot HaMizrach, and for the Hasidim, you make a tikkun. I went with my wife recently to be Menachem Avel, members of our shul. One of the members, she lost her father, and it was the last day of the Yahrzeit, and they are Eidot HaMizrach, maybe Moroccan, okay? And we get to the shul in Pisgat Zev. That's where they were that night, and it wasn't a Beis Avel. They had a big Suda, okay? It was the tone was not typical, okay? For the Sfardim, they celebrate such a thing in a certain sense. Okay, yes, please.
Does anybody have a minhag to just see you?
I'm sure. They learn portions of the Zohar and things related to Rabbi Shimon and other portions of Torah.
No.
The whole concept, by the way, of a tikkun in Kabbalah is learning sections of Torah and sections of Zohar, etc. Talk about celebrating Yahrzeit. So the shul I grew up in Passaic, New Jersey, maybe some of you are familiar, Tifereth, Israel. It's in its third location. The shul was founded, 150 years ago, maybe a little bit less, maybe 130 years ago, whatever, by Galicianers that immigrated to Passaic, New Jersey. Passaic was an old industrial town. My family came to Passaic in like 1903, 1904, something like that. And they davened in the Galicianer shul. Ich bin a Galicianer. And so growing up, there were many days when we didn't say Tachanun. First of all, the minhag was not to say Tachanun at Mincha, ever. They never said Mincha at Tachanun. There's some Hasidim who have that minhag. Tachanun, as you know, is a reshus. I think we spoke about Tachanun when we learned Hilchos Tefillah together. And then they had this big calendar, and they wouldn't say Tachanun if it was the Yahrzeit of some Rebbe. They would look, right? Oh, today is some Rebbe's Yahrzeit, even if it's not our Rebbe, some Rebbe. So there were many days they didn't say Tachanun. Okay, Tachanun is a reshus. And the joke was that you look on the calendar, and today no Rebbe died. Well, that's cause for celebration. That's happy. No Rebbe died. Don't say Tachanun. Okay, so this is a question that we have to grapple with. Do you celebrate the anniversary of someone's death? Maybe historically not, but certainly over time it becomes a minhag due to Kabbalistic and Hasidic influence. But to make things even more complicated, historically, Lag Ba'Omer was a fast day. And I call your attention here to a very important source number 7. This is Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim Siman Taf Kuf Pei, the end of Hilchos Tanios, the laws of fasts, where the Shulchan Aruch records certain days when historically we fasted. Eilu hayamim she'eru bahem tsaros lavosenu v'rayu lihisanos bahem v'ra'ui lihisanos bahem. These are days when tragedies befell our ancestors, and it's proper to fast on these days. We learned together, if you recall, Hilchos Tanios, why we fast. The Afal Pisha Mitzvah Rosh Chodesh, some of them fall out on Rosh Chodesh, right? You still fast. Okay. In any case, very important passage. Now, the truth is, I don't know if anyone today fasts on these days, except maybe for Zion Adar. Zion Adar, of course, is what? Is the anniversary of the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's also his birthday, right? And that would seem to be the only one of these fasts which is really still observed. It's observed by members of the Chevra Kadisha. Maybe some of you have served on the Chevra Kadisha. So they fast on the 7th of Adar. And then Motzei, the fast, they have a special Suda to honor those who participate in this Chesed Shel Emes. Okay, so you have Be'echad B'Nisan Mesu B'nei Aaron. On the 1st of Nisan, the sons of Aaron died, Nadav and Avihu. Basara Bo Mesa Miriam, V'Nistalik HaBe'er. Okay, on the 10th of Nisan, Miriam died, and the well in her zchus disappeared, and the Jews started to complain about water, of course. This is important. And on the 26th day of Nisan, according to the version that we have here, that appears in the Shulchan Aruch, the 26th of Nisan is the anniversary of the death of whom? Yehoshua bin Nun. And by the way, today, people will go to Yoshua's tomb or some tomb that is associated with Yoshua ben Nun? That's another question too. All these kivrei tzaddikim and kvaros surround the country. Are we so sure that Grant is buried in Grant's tomb? Lahavdil, not so pasha, but that's also for another time. In any case, you have people who go on the 26th day of Nisan to the grave of Yoshua ben Nun. It's in some Arab village. They go with police escort. Okay. Now, as I said, this is the version which appears in the Shulchan Aruch, but there are earlier versions. It appears in a number of places, and a Geniza fragment revealed, which is the most authoritative version of this passage here. A Geniza fragment was discovered and revealed that actually Yoshua ben Nun's Yurtzeit is the 18th of Iyar, not the 26th of Nisan, but the 18th of Iyar, which is what? Well, tomorrow, Lag Ba'Omer. So, again, the most authoritative version of this passage has it that Yoshua ben Nun died on the 18th of Iyar, which is Lag Ba'Omer. So that means historically Lag Ba'Omer was not a festival, it was a fast day for Klal Yisrael. Okay? And it was also a tragic day, a day that will, to borrow the expression, live in infamy from the 4th century and on. The Holy Roman Emperor Julianus HaKofer, Julian the Apostate, he ruled from 361 to 363, very short period of time. Why is he called a Kofer? Was it because he said that Lag Ba'Omer is not Rabbi Shimon's Yurtzeit, or that Rabbi Shimon did not author the Zohar? No, he was called a Kofer because he rejected Christianity and wanted to return the Roman Empire to paganism. He dies mysteriously. Historians assume he was assassinated. He was very favorable to the Jews. Scholars will debate exactly why that was. But what we do know is that in July of the year 362 of the Common Era, he met with Jewish leaders on his way to fight the Persians. And he asks them, why are you no longer offering animal sacrifice? Now, why was he interested in restoring the Avodas HaKorbanos? Was he a Kohen? No, he wanted to return the Roman Empire to paganism. He wanted to restore animal sacrifice. Okay, it's interesting. I was with my wife a number of years ago in Athens, Greece, at the Acropolis, right? And we saw different things and images, and I'm trying to think of the right word, where it's something that comes from a building, something that's carved into a building, like a facade, but the facade, there's a different name for it. In any case, fancy name. I'm trying to impress you, but starting to forget my English, although it's probably a Greek word. In any case, it'll come to me, of them sacrificing a pig. You know, the ancient Greeks sacrificing a pig. And for me, that gave me new pshat in, I don't recall if it's in the book of the Maccabees or Megillas Antiochus, but you're taught as a child that they brought non-kosher animals and pigs into the Beis Hamikdash when the Greeks took over and the Hellenists had control over the Beis Hamikdash. They sacrificed a pig. So as a child, you read that and you always think like, oh, wow, they did that intentionally because a pig is so impure for us as Jews, but maybe that was just what they offered at the time. I don't know. In any case, here, Julian the Apostate, he's an apostate because he wants to restore paganism and restore animal sacrifice. So he sends a letter to Hillel II, the Nasi, where he writes that he wants to allow the Jews to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash and resettle Yerushalayim following his victory against the Persians. But feeling it just can't wait, on his way to fight the Persians, he meets in the month of Shvat of the year 363 with Jewish leaders in Antioch, and they make concrete plans. They discuss materials and architects and craftsmen, builders, even a date on which to lay the foundation. Some claim, by the way, that a foundation had already been laid, and that foundation is what the Dome of the Rock is built upon, but that is subject to debate. So they had plans. But on May 18th and 19th of the year 363, a major earthquake dashed their plans. What was May 18th to 19th, 363 on the Jewish calendar? Lag Ba'Omer. It happened on Lag Ba'Omer. In July of that year, shortly after, Julianus HaKofer, Julian the Apostate, dies on the Persian front. Many assume that it was most likely foul play. He was assassinated, and that sealed our fate. Wasn't meant to be. Perhaps it was too soon, but that took place on Lag Ba'Omer, that earthquake which prevented us from being able to build. And so historically, Lag Ba'Omer was a tragic day. So how did it develop into what it is, into what Rav Chaim Vital describes here in source number 6? This Minhag Yisrael, that's Yadua, how he describes the Ari, his teacher, going up to Meron with his son. How does that develop? So I'll share with you some possible theories. Some scholars suggest that on or around Pesach Sheni, we just had Pesach Sheni, of course, or this time of year, maybe around the 18th of Iyar, this time of year, you would have Ole Regel. Now, this is post-Churban, but Ole Regel gathering around Meron, and that became a rendezvous point from where they would travel together to Yerushalayim to come on Aliyah L'Regel, even post-Churban. It's fascinating. The historical record is rich with accounts of people coming on Aliyah L'Regel, even post-Churban, and then the poskim discuss and debate, can you fulfill a mitzvah of Re'iyah without the accompanying Korban, without the Olas Re'iyah? But Meron would seem to have been a rendezvous point, and I've written on this, an article in Hebrew published in Tchumen and in English in the Journal of Halacha and Contemporary Society. They would dafka come on Aliyah L'Regel for Shavuos. So you find a lot of evidence for this. So some scholars suggest that you had these groups who would rendezvous at Meron, up in the north, right, around this time of year. And that's what began the pilgrimages to Meron long before the Ari. There are other theories as well. There are some sources, medieval sources, 11th century, 12th century, that describe pilgrimages to the graves of Hillel and Shammai on Pesach Sheni, and some contend that maybe that was the initial minhag, and that sort of over time transmigrates, goes through Gilgulim, and becomes pilgrimages to the grave of Rabbi Shimon in Meron, but initially it was Pesach Sheni at Hillel and Shammai. There's another source which is really important to this discussion, and that is here in source number 9. It's a tshuva of the Radbaz, Rabbi David Ibn Shlomo Ibn Zimra, who lives from 1573, he lives from 1479 to 1573. 1479 to 1573. So he's a contemporary of the Ari and Rav Chaim Vital and the Shulchan Aruch. He was a Rav in Cairo, a Rav in Yerushalayim, ultimately sitting in Tzfas on the Beis Din of the Shulchan Aruch. So he's part of that whole milieu, and he lives around the same time as what we saw described in the Shar HaKavanos in source number 6. And in this tshuva, by the way, he was a major posek, he's a major achron. He wrote a Perush on the Rambam and wrote thousands and thousands of tshuvos. Thousands. You go to the Bar Ilan database, it's thousands of tshuvos. Okay? So he describes here in source number 9, in this tshuva of Chelek Beis, a minhag to shave or cut a child's hair at the grave of Shmuel Hanavi and weigh the hair and give its weight in gold, silver, chveis, whatever, to tzedakah and light candles. Now, why dafka the kever of Shmuel Hanavi? And this is one of the early sources for the minhag of the Chalakeh. But why dafka by Shmuel? So some explain, well, Shmuel was a what? A Nazir, so maybe there's some sort of connection to the hair. Others claim that the whole business of cutting a child's hair might have crept in from some other religion, but that's for another time. I've already said enough apicorsis this morning. But what he describes here is a father who makes a neder to take his son and cut his son's hair at the kever of Shmuel Hanavi, but now Jews are denied access to the grave of Shmuel Hanavi. So what do? Look here where I've underlined. Make my opinion known. I was asked, make your opinion known where a father made a neder. Someone who made a neder, legaleches beno, to cut his son's hair, b'makom Shmuel Hanavi, at the grave of Shmuel Hanavi. He finds now it's in Gentile control. Ba'avonos, maybe due to our sins. Ve'ein Yisrael yachol likanes sham. And they don't allow Jews to access the site. Matakana yeshlo, what can he do? He made a neder. Is it a shuas shav? And the community there doesn't let any Jews in. They won't let them access the site. And we know that when Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, Saladin conquers Jerusalem in the late 12th century, he builds a mosque on the site where there had already been a fortress and no longer allows access to Jews, or perhaps that comes a little bit later when Jews could not access the site. So the issue that he discusses is, well, when did the father make the neder? Was the father aware when he made the neder that the site was inaccessible and he still went ahead and made his neder? Or did he unknowingly make the neder because he thought he could fulfill it, but due to unforeseen circumstances, they don't allow Jews access to the site. So that's the pilpul, that's a lumdus here. But what you see here is that around the very same time that the Shar HaKavanos describes how the Ari is going up to Meron on Lag Ba'Omer to the kever of Rashbi, we have a description of a father who wants to cut his son's hair at the kever of who? Shmuel Hanavi. Now that's curious. So look back at source number 7, this passage that really holds the key to understanding the historicity of Lag Ba'Omer. B'chaf ches bo meis Shmuel Hanavi. There's a tradition that Shmuel died when? On the 28th of Iyar. Yom Yerushalayim. The Magen Avram had a different version, the Chaf Tes. The Magen Avram here in source number 8 writes that he died on the 28th of Iyar. By the way, there are people who will go to Kever Shmuel Hanavi Dafka on Chaf Ches Iyar, or if they pass him like the Magen Avram, maybe on Chaf Tes. But you see that what? Very close to Lag Ba'Omer, very close to Yud Ches Iyar, you have the Yuret site of Shmuel Hanavi. So some suggest that what? That initially the practice was to make pilgrimages this time of year to the grave of Shmuel Hanavi, who was a Nazir. Give your child a haircut there. But once they're no longer allowing Jews access to the site in the 16th century, or perhaps earlier, right? 15th, 16th century, we don't know exactly. So then the custom gets transferred up north from just north of us in Ramot, the kever of Shmuel, further north to Meron, to the kever of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And perhaps the custom originates with this practice that people would go to the grave of Shmuel Hanavi around this time of year, and then it gets it moves north, so to speak. Okay. By the way, here in Yerushalayim there was a minhag to visit the grave of Shimon HaTzadik on Lag Ba'Omer. I guess if you can't get to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Meron, you go to your local Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik on Lag Ba'Omer. Prior to World War II and even to today, there was a minhag to visit the grave of the Ramah in Krakow. Now, as I said, not so clear if Lag Ba'Omer is the Yuret site of Rashbi, but we know it is the Yuret site of the Ramah. We'll actually come back to that point in our second shir. So people would go on Lag Ba'Omer to visit the grave of the Ramah in Krakow. Some do until this day. What many people are unaware of is that some of the major poskim, some of the major achronim, voiced objection to celebrating Lag Ba'Omer in Meron. The first here is the Chasam Sofer in source number 10. The Chasam Sofer lived from 1762 to 1839. He was the Rav and Rosh Hashiva in Presburg, which is today Bratislava. Maybe some of you have been there. And he writes a tshuva. It's interesting. The story of Rabbi Shimon in the cave is Shabbos Daf Lamed Gimel. Okay, the whole story goes over a few dafim, but it's Shabbos Daf Lamed Gimel. Here, I don't know if it was done intentionally, but the Chasam Sofer writes a tshuva about Lag Ba'Omer, Yoredeya Siman Reish Lamed Gimel. Okay, easy to remember, Reish Lamed Gimel. So this tshuva, by the way, he begins discussing the Kedusha of Yerushalayim. Does Yerushalayim retain its sanctity, its Kedusha? The last Mishnah in Ksuvos, Hakol Malin Yerushalayim Ve'en Hakol Motziin, is that Mishnah relevant today, or do we say post-Churban Yerushalayim loses its Kedusha, loses its sanctity? So it's in that context that the Chasam Sofer strongly objects to celebrating Lag BaOmer. He says, firstly, he sees it as a slight to the honor of Yerushalayim. He says, you're turning Tzfas and Meron into a Talpiot, which is a reference to Yerushalayim. You're making pilgrimages up north. Don't make pilgrimages up north. Make pilgrimages to Jerusalem, to Yerushalayim Yer HaKodesh. And he actually has a hesped, a eulogy, which appears in his drashos following this major earthquake that took place in Tzfas. We spoke about the earthquake of the 4th century. Well, there's a major earthquake in Tzfas in 1837, which destroyed the city. And there, I mean, you'd think this is a hesped? This is only a hesped that the Chasam Sofer could give, because in the hesped, he indicts them for forsaking Yerushalayim and blaming them for the earthquake. He sees it as a divine punishment because they settled, instead of settling in Yerushalayim, they settled in the Galil, they settled in Tzfat, they settled in Tveria, in these places. Okay. Again, it's a hesped that only the Chasam Sofer could give. Yeah. Okay, could be, but okay. Well, that's how the Chasam Sofer felt, and he sees going up and making pilgrimages. You're being ola l'regel lahavdil to Meron. Not nice. It's a slight to the kavod of Yerushalayim. And then he continues and sees creating a holiday on which no miracle, no Yeshua, no Hatzalah happened, also is problematic. Right? How can you just create a Stam Yantif? He says here, where I've underlined, it's one thing to say that the customs of mourning are suspended. You're making a holiday on a day when there was no nace, no Hatzalah, no Yeshua, no miraculous salvation, and it's not mentioned anywhere. Right? It's not mentioned anywhere. The only thing that we have is maybe, some hints at the fact that the students stopped dying and therefore the customs of mourning are suspended. But it's a big leap to say that the customs of mourning are suspended on Lag BaOmer to then celebrating as a yontif, and he objects to it. How can you establish a yontif? Now here, he mentions Purim Frankfurt, Purim Vincennes, which he talks about in another tshuva as well. He was born in Frankfurt, lived in Frankfurt before he left, and he writes how both he and his Rabbi Nassan Adler were careful, even though they didn't live there anymore, to continue and celebrate Purim Frankfurt. It's a fascinating story, not for now. I think I spoke about it once in the context of Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim. But what's interesting is here in this tshuva, he says he condemns them for creating a holiday when there's no nace, no Hatzalah, no Yeshua for the Jewish people. But then he goes on to say just the opposite, that we have a mitzvah, he writes, min haTorah, to create a holiday and give thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on a day when we do see some nace, when we are recipients of nisim and iflos, when there is some Yeshua. Okay? And throughout Jewish history, and as I said, he writes in other tshuvos, Orach Chaim Kuf Tzadi Aleph, he talks about how there's a mitzvah and he defends the practice from the Pri Chodosh who argues against it, and he talks about Purim Frankfurt there. And throughout Jewish history, you have tens and tens of Jewish communities and individuals who created a yontif, a holiday like Purim, to commemorate some miraculous salvation, some Yeshua. Many tshuvos which record such minhagim. It's brought down in Hilchos Purim, in the Chayei Adam, in the Magen Avram, in the Mishnah Berurah, that many communities created a Purim Sheni. Okay, you have Purim Mitzrayim and Purim Frankfurt, I mentioned, and Purim Saragossa. Tens and tens of communities. I published on this as well. And the chief rabbinate, together with leading poskim, cite these precedents when they establish Yom Ha'atzmaut, and later Yom Yerushalayim as Yomim Tovim L'Yisrael. Okay, so to me, it's very ironic that you have Lag Ba'Omer, right, smack in the middle of these 2 days, Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, and Lag Ba'Omer. The whole origin is very questionable. Is it the Yahrzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? Really unclear, right? And how do you celebrate it as a Yontif? And the Chasam Sofer says no miracle happened, and you're creating a Yontif, right? And here it's smack in the middle of Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, days of tremendous nisim v'niflos, days of tremendous religious significance and religious meaning. And halavai, all those hundreds of thousands each year who flock to Meron and treat Lag Ba'Omer as such a holy day. Halavai, those same hundreds of thousands should also celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, days of tremendous religious significance, profound religious significance and meaning. Halavai, they should celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim with the same zeal. Other poskim objected to celebrating Lag Ba'Omer. The Sholem Meshiv, Rav Yosef Shalom Nathanson, asks the question that Jake asked: do we celebrate death? Do we celebrate a Yahrzeit? That's number one. And then he says number two, Bal Tashchis. Somehow, and that's a shir for another time, and what it means, that somehow they developed this minhag to throw clothes into the bonfire. And I guess maybe you cleaned your house there of Pesach. Have all sorts of interpretations and meaning. They throw clothing. There's some Admor, some Rebbe who throws his necktie. Not too many Hasidim wear neckties to begin with. I don't know, but there's some Rebbe, I think it's maybe the Boyan Rebbe, some Rebbe throws his necktie in. Again, it's maybe about shedding physicality, chitzonius, gashmius. I don't know. Consult your local Orthodox Hasidic Rebbe as to what it exactly means. But the Sholem Meshiv is concerned for the Bal Tashchis. More recently, Yosef writes in Shuvos that he's concerned about the pritzus, men and women together, congregating in Meron. He's concerned for improper shchita. Others are concerned for bittul Torah. Rav Elyashiv was famously asked about Lag Ba'Omer, and he said he feels closer to Rashbi by learning a Blat Gemara. Right? Rashbi appears in every parak in Shas. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was asked a similar question, bittul Torah, by Talmidim of his who wanted to go up north to visit Kivrei Tzadikim. Is it bittul Torah to sit on a bus for 2.5, 3 hours each way? And he said, why do you have to go up north? You have all these Tzadikim, Kedoshim, that gave their lives for our people here in Har Herzl, just across the street from Beit Vagat. Okay. So I don't know about bittul Torah. Today, people don't need an excuse for bittul Torah. They find many reasons, many ways to justify bittul Torah. So I went to Meron once, full confession. Okay, I went there once to be yotzei. I took my 2 eldest boys when they were little. Again, just to be yotzei. I didn't see what Rav Ovadia describes. I didn't see any pritzus there. Men and women were separate. It was very modest. I didn't see any shchita there. I didn't see anyone bringing a little lambs to slaughter. What I did see was tremendous achdus. Everywhere you go, they want to give you a sandwich, a drink, give kids candies. They're doing an upshir and a chalakah. They want to give you something. They want to make a l'chaim with you. It's a beautiful thing. Even on the bus up there, we got tickets in advance. Eged has these buses. They have special roads and lanes that get you there quick. Right? We were just in and out. We left early in the morning before the crowds and came back in the early afternoon before the crowds. But on the bus, they're singing, dancing, making l'chaims on the bus. Okay, hopefully the driver wasn't drinking. But you feel a tremendous sense of achdus. You have Hasidim together with religious Zionists dancing together for hours on end. It's really a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful avirah. It's a beautiful avirah. Okay. So now that I constructed Lag Ba'Omer or deflated your Lag Ba'Omer, perhaps destroyed your Lag Ba'Omer, what is worth celebrating? Well, I think there is something worth celebrating. Going back to the Gemara that we began with, where the Gemara describes how, according to Rabbi Akiva, you have to raise up students in your youth and in your old age. You have to keep going. Sow your seed in the morning, like the pasuk says, and don't rest your hand at night. Don't give up. And then the Gemara goes on to describe how 24,000 of his students died in one fell swoop, in one period of time. Right? You can imagine how painful that was. And the world was shamim. It was empty of Torah. Rabbi Akiva he was able to pull himself together. He didn't throw in the towel. He didn't give up. He didn't go into early retirement. But Rabbi Akiva went down to the rabbis in the south and raised up 5 great students, the greatest of which is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. As I said, there's not one chapter of Shas that doesn't have a teaching of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He had the strength of spirit to continue and raise up new Talmidim. I'm sure it wasn't easy, but in doing so, he ensured the continuity of our Masorah. Early in my teaching career, I was still in yeshiva when tragically I had two Talmidim of mine pass away. I was teaching at the Masifta of North Jersey, a high school for boys, which used to be at the IDT building in Newark, for those of you familiar. And my Talmud, Ari Seidenfeld, Olav Shalom, both of them in Adar, a few years apart, but one on the 11th of Adar and one on the 12th of Adar. So each year I make a siyuk. And then years later, my grandfather actually passed away on the 11th of Adar. So I had 2 Talmidim, Ari Seinfeld and Aaron Haley, Aleim Shalom, Shea Zichron Baruch. And you know, it was very painful. I remember speaking to my rabbi at the time, and you know, he was trying to offer support about Emunah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu and everything. It's for a reason. I said to him, you know, I'm not having a crisis of faith. I'm just in pain. It was very tragic, very painful. So, you know, I drew strength from the great Rabbi Akiva. I continue to draw strength from Rabbi Akiva, who lost all of his students, 24,000 students, but yet found the courage to go on and raise up new students, even in his old age, to replenish the Torah that was in jeopardy and that could have been lost, and ensure the continuity of our Masorah, ensure that the flame of our Torah continues to burn like those bonfires. And I think that is certainly something worth celebrating. I'll take any questions and then we'll take a break.